Fry considers this quite urgent. Israel's strategic options. Yoav Limor, an Israeli military analyst, has said after 925 days of fighting since October 7, Israel has failed to achieve decisive victory on any front and is now perceived as a country whose decisions are not made in Jerusalem but in Washington. Thus, it's not just a military failure, it's an existential political crisis for a nation whose entire security doctrine rests on sovereign decision-making backed by unbreakable US support. The urgency is that we don't know what Israel is going to do. We always say we don't know what Trump's going to do. He's easier to read than Israel. Okay, and this does affect some of Fry's portfolio. So quickly, the 5 options we'll be discussing: diplomatic sabotage, unilateral strikes, regime change proxy, Lebanon spoiler, coalition collapse. And we'll discuss these in terms of probability, capability, and market impact. The fracture. Why 1973 is the right analogy. Why the Hersh disclosure is strategically catastrophic for Israel. The most important sentence in Seymour Hersh's 29th of April report, see my earlier video, is not the dollar figure. It is that Trump no longer trusts Israel and believes he was misled by Netanyahu about the potential for success of the joint bombing campaign. This is not a tactical disagreement between allies. This strikes at the foundation assumption of Israel's security doctrine for 4 decades, that the US-Israel relationship is structurally unbreakable regardless of bilateral tensions at the margins. They didn't consider Trump. The 3 structural consequences. 40 years of doctrine. Israel's security has always been predicted on US support as an unconditional backstop. If Trump is genuinely prepared to pay Iran $20 billion without coordinating with Jerusalem, the backstop has conditions. That changes Israel's decision-making at every level. The deep bunker problem. This is not just political, it's physically constraining. The hardened underground facility where Iran may be rebuilding its enrichment capabilities requires US B-2 bombers with massive ordnance penetrations to destroy. Israel does not have that asset. Without the US cooperation, the bunker survives regardless of what Israel does. The Trump fracture is therefore not just a diplomatic inconvenience, it's a hard military constraint on Israel's primary objective. Very importantly, elections under zealots. Netanyahu's coalition is held together by Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, whose political base would view a Trump-Iran deal paying $25 billion as an existential betrayal. They would collapse the government rather than accept that deal. Netanyahu is governing with a coalition that has less room for maneuver than at any point since its formation. And again, remember, Netanyahu goes to court on serious corruption charges as soon as he loses being PM. Why 1973 is the right analogy. In 1973, Israel launched the Yom Kippur War, and initially faced catastrophic reversal before US emergency resupply turned the tide of the war. The lesson Israel drew was, you are never truly safe without guaranteed US backing. The current situation is the inverse. The US appears to be stepping back from that guarantee precisely when Iran remains a nuclear threshold state. That is the deepest strategic shock Israel has faced in 50 years. Option 1, diplomatic sabotage. The most immediately available lever and almost certainly already deployed. This option is not hypothetical, it is already happening. Netanyahu challenged Trump's ceasefire within hours of it being announced. The diplomatic sabotage toolkit is live in Lebanon. A key here is that Israel does not need to do anything dramatic to sabotage the deal. The deal is already fragile. Iran's internal division, Rubio's pushback, the CENTCOM military option all create natural friction. Israel's job is simply to ensure that friction is never resolved. The 4 tools in detail. Intelligence leaking. Israel has the most sophisticated signals intelligence operation in the Middle East, and it is documented history of leaking selectively to damage diplomatic processes it opposes. Expect bombshell revelations about Iran's nuclear activity. The IRGC operations or Hezbollah movements timed to coincide with critical negotiating moments. The goal is not to provide information, it is to create political pressure in Washington that makes concessions impossible. Consider yesterday's video where it was released that it was $200 billion Trump was willing to pay Iran. It's actually $25 billion that Hersh reported. Okay, US Congress. AIPAC's influence in Congress remains the most powerful foreign policy lobby in Washington. Senate hawks Tom Cotton and Lindsey Graham have already signaled opposition to any deal that defers the nuclear issue. Expect legislative action, sanction bills, conditions on any Iran payment, war power constraints that boxes Trump in regardless of his executive intentions. Gulf state pressure. Saudi Arabia and the UAE fear a resurgent Iran more than they want cheaper oil. Israel can work through these channels, often indirectly, through the Abraham Accords architecture, to harden Gulf opposition to any deal that leaves Iran's nuclear program intact. The Gulf states have their own interests in prolonging Iran's weakness. Slow walk. Netanyahu has successfully slow-walked every diplomatic track for 3 decades. He agreed to the ceasefire at Trump's request, but immediately said, "We're not finished yet." Every procedural, legal, and diplomatic mechanism available will be used to extend the negotiating clock beyond Trump's political attention span. Trump's attention span is the key variable. If another crisis dominates the news cycle, the Iran track stalls naturally. Option 4, Lebanon escalation as a spoiler. The asymmetric risk that markets are not pricing. This is the most important slide in the presentation for our portfolio management. The Lebanon spoiler scenario is the single biggest near-term threat to the Hormuz diplomatic track, and no options chain is pricing it as a Brent catalyst. The mechanism is simple. Israel escalates in Lebanon, framed as a proportionate response to Hezbollah provocation, which is available on demand as Hezbollah has been firing drones throughout the ceasefire in response to Israel's attacks. Iran is dragged back into the active conflict. Any Hormuz deal becomes politically impossible. The diplomatic track collapses. Brent respikes. Why this is the most dangerous option for markets? Deniability. Unlike a unilateral nuclear strike, a Lebanon escalation is operationally ambiguous. Israel is already striking southern Lebanon. Hezbollah is already firing drones. An escalation can be presented as purely defensive. Come on, fellas, I'm just responding to Hezbollah's aggression. Fair cop. And initially framed by markets as a separate conflict unrelated to Hormuz. The algorithm gap. Markets have been trained to treat Lebanon as a contained conflict, separate from the Hormuz disruption. The oil market algorithms that do not automatically connect a Lebanon escalation to a Brent spike. There is a lag, and that lag is a trading opportunity for the punters who understand the connection, like Fryer does. The taco gap in reverse. The market is currently pricing deal optimism from the Hersh report and Iran's Hormuz proposal, which Trump has already said is not acceptable. If Israel fires the spoiler, the market has to reprice, but it will do so with a lag because it initially miscategorized the Lebanon escalation. That miscategorization gap is where the asymmetric opportunity sits. Fryers watching for a significant Israeli escalation in southern Lebanon beyond current strike patterns, specifically targeting Hezbollah's remaining missile infrastructure. Trump's reaction: if he calls Netanyahu and says scale back as before, the spoiler fails. If Trump is distracted or indifferent, the spoiler succeeds. Iranian response: if Iran threatens to reopen active hostilities in response to a Lebanese escalation, the Hormuz deal is dead, regardless of what Trump wants. Brent price action. A Lebanon spoiler would produce a $5 to $10 Brent spike within 24 to 48 hours. That's the signal. Unilateral nuclear strikes. The zealot's dream. Physically constrained without US assets. This option is already partially underway. Israel has conducted unilateral strikes on Iranian nuclear sites during the current campaign. These were confirmed by the IDF whilst CENTCOM stayed silent, which is itself significant. Israel is leading nuclear strike operations independently of the United States. The critical distinction is between what Israel can do and what it needs to complete the job. The strikes already conducted have targeted accessible facilities. The one that matters most, the deep bunker that Western intelligence assesses could host a new enrichment plant, is 100 meters underground and requires US massive ordnance perpetrators delivered by the huge B-2 bombers. The constraint: without these B-2 bombers, Israel's deepest strike capability cannot reach the target. The Trump fracture is therefore not just political, but a physical military constraint on Israel's primary strategic objective. Netanyahu cannot say this publicly without admitting dependency. And the wild card within the wild card. A sufficiently extreme Israeli government might attempt the strike anyway, not to succeed but to make a political statement. A failed attempt that kills Iranian nuclear scientists and destroys accessible facilities whilst managing the deep bunker could be presented domestically, as we tried, and internationally as proof that Iran needs to negotiate. Of course, this is not rational strategy. It is the logic of a political coalition that is under existential pressure, but has zealots, powerful zealots. Regime change and coalition collapse. First, the failed endgame. Regime change by proxy was Netanyahu's ideological North Star, his life's work of 40 years, as the Carnegie Endowment put it. The theory was degrade the regime from the air to the point it can no longer suppress its own population, and the Iranian punters will do the rest. The theory has failed the empirical test. Very few Iranians responded to Netanyahu's unilateral public street uprising appeal. Mojadab Kanami, the new supreme leader, is consolidating his position rather than collapsing. The protests of January 2026 were most significant since 1979, were crushed before the war began, and the wartime security state has made further protests even less likely. Trump's role. Trump personally killed the coordinated street uprising call, telling Netanyahu, "Why the hell should we tell people to take to the street when they'll just get mowed down?" That moment encapsulates the US-Israel divergence and on how much internal Iranian bloodshed is acceptable in pursuit of regime change. Trump sees it as a bonus if the regime collapses. Netanyahu sees it as a primary objective. Okay, next, the wild card. Domestic coalition collapse. It's a fragile coalition. This is the scenario that most directly threatens to produce an irrational outcome. If Ben-Gvir and Smotrich collapse the coalition, which they easily can, over a Trump-Iran deal, the resulting election would produce an even more extreme government, if you can believe that. One that pursues option 2 unilaterally and fails, and pursues option 4 with reckless intensity. The paradox is that the political collapse most feared by those who want stability may produce the most destabilizing outcome of all. A Netanyahu government constrained by Trump is preferable to a Ben-Gvir government constrained by no one. No one can constrain a Ben-Gvir government. By Fry's standards anyway, he's loopy. Watch Israel domestic politics very closely. Elections are due later in 2026, but Ben-Gvir could create them to come earlier whenever he wants. Portfolio implications. How Israel's options affect Fry's active positions. The Lebanon spoiler, option 4, is the primary portfolio risk to monitor. It is the most likely near-term Israeli action, and it is the one that most directly threatens the assumption of diplomatic progress that currently underlies deal optimism pricing in the oil markets. So Oxy, looking at a bull put spread, July 17. The Oxy entry thesis rests on the Hormuz disruption continuing to support oil prices. A Lebanon spoiler reinforces this thesis. However, the timing entry becomes more complex. If Lebanon escalates as markets are pricing in a Hormuz deal, in other words, Brent's falling, Oxy may temporarily gap down before recovering on the re-escalation. The spread structure protects us below 56.54, but we need to enter at the right moment. We don't want to enter on Sunday evening, of course. Wait for Monday's open. Wait to see whether the market leads with deal optimism or Lebanon fear. Hard to pick at this stage. USO and CVX. Long oil thesis. All 5 Israeli options reinforce the long oil thesis. Options 1 and 4, most likely, keep Hormuz disrupted. Option 2, unilateral nuclear strike, would produce a Brent strike to $40 or $50 in the Goldman scenario range. Option 5, coalition collapse, produces a more aggressive Israeli government. The macro thesis would be even more strong. Next, one that we are very interested in, but have got to watch the timing. SOX, short thesis. Lebanon escalation directly affects semiconductor supply chains. As we've mentioned, Israel is a significant bromine producer. Israel military escalation adds a direct supply chain negative to the existing Hormuz helium thesis. The bear case compounds. LNG and GLD, a Lebanon spoiler that collapses the diplomatic track would spike LNG spot prices, as Qatari exports will be disrupted for years to come. And gold, safe haven bid. Both represent optimistic entries if the spoiler scenario materializes in the next 1 or 2 weeks. Watch for entry confirmation. Okay, the bottom line. Options 1 and 4 most likely. Diplomatic sabotage plus a Lebanon escalation as a spoiler. This is Israel's default combination. Available, deniable, immediately executable, and does not require US consent. Netanyahu has used both tools throughout his career. The only restraint is Trump's willingness to intervene by phone, and it appears that willingness is diminishing. Option 2, physically constrained. The deep bunker strike requires the US bombers. The Trump fracture is not political, it's a hard military constraint that Israel cannot publicly acknowledge. The zealots want it anyway. The physics prevent it. Unless the new government takes power and attempts it anyway as a political statement, which is possible, quite possible. Option 3 already failed. The popular Iranian uprising did not materialize. Ayatollah Khamenei, the new leader, is consolidating. So the regime change by proxy theory has failed. Netanyahu is not publicly acknowledged the failure. Option 5, the wild card, domestic coalition collapse, producing a more extreme government. This is the scenario that most directly threatens irrational escalation. Watch Israeli elections and coalition stability. Ben-Gvir is the variable and he's evil. Please remember, decisions are not made in Jerusalem, they are being made in Washington. However, the market hasn't priced in what happens when Netanyahu decides that is no longer acceptable. Consider. Happy weekend.